Hello and welcome to the July 23rd edition of Ukraine Without Hype. I am Anthony Bardaway. In this episode of Ukraine Without Hype, we will unfortunately be having to go over a rather serious political crisis currently happening in Kyiv, with the rather aggressive attack by the Ukrainian government on its anti-corruption apparatuses. But first, this will be a news roundup. Our last episode was our audio essay, I think we can call it, on Hungary, the Hungarian relationship with the international far right, and how that is playing in with relationships between Europe, Hungary especially, and Ukraine. That episode did a tremendous amount of effort that go into it. I'm glad that received a good reception. Some updates on that situation, though, is that in the time since I released that episode, Orban has continued to go on a absurd rhetorical offensive against Ukraine. At one point, he even said that he doesn't even know where the borders of Ukraine are or what its population is. It's the country that you already formally recognized as existing. Nothing has changed since then. In fact, Hungary has not formally changed that recognition either. So he's just making obnoxious noises. And as we get closer and closer to the elections next year, and there has been yet another round of polling that says that Orban and his Fidesz party are in rather tragic situation right now, they're going to lose. Everything says they're going to lose, and every poll that comes out says they're going to lose even harder than the previous one that came out. But that is where we stand on Hungary. They have gone through yet another round of hysterics complaining about how Ukraine is the enemy. But before we go on, if you would like to contribute to supporting Ukraine Without Hype, please go to patreon.com/Ukraine Without Hype. Thank you all very much for the support, and on with the show. So our battlefield update, we can say that the Russian offensive against Sumy has completely stalled out. There has been no forward movement at all this month, really. So that is going to be yet another front that Ukraine is going to have to commit troops to in order to prevent Russia from expanding from. However, that offensive has, like with Kharkiv, been blunted. It's just going to be yet another static front. But much more importantly is the battle for Pokrovsk. The battle for Pokrovsk seems to be entering its terminal phase. How long that may be, it could be a few months, could last throughout the rest of the year, who knows. But the writing seems to be on the wall that the Ukrainian position in Pokrovsk will eventually no longer be tenable. As we've been following this news for the past few months of how Russia has been able to penetrate the lines that lie between Pokrovsk and the rest of the Donbass front, that has continued onward, and the Russian effort right now is to get as far north of Pokrovsk as possible, bypassing other defenses. The Russians have heavily bombed the towns and villages to the north of Pokrovsk. Dobropilya, which is one of the larger settlements to the north of Pokrovsk, has been bombed quite heavily. Dobropilya, of course, being near the front has meant that it has not been an easy life for the people there, but up until now has been pretty significantly behind Ukrainian lines and therefore not under as much direct threat. But now that its area is the main target for the Russian advance, the Russians have bombed apartment buildings there. There have been casualties. And as with everything, this area is now a focus for evacuation efforts. Dobropilya is currently being evacuated. Most of this area to the north of Pokrovsk is being evacuated. And with every other evacuation, it follows the same patterns. People do not want to leave. Many people do not even think they can leave. But as with everywhere else, as the fighting gets closer, most of them will leave, with the ones staying behind largely accepting death. We have seen some interviews with people in Pokrovsk who have said that, yeah, they're old, they don't have anyone to take care of them. They will stay in their homes until they die. And that is the reality for the front line. So as Russia is progressing further north of Pokrovsk, the city is now being put into a semi-cauldron. It is not under severe threat right now. It's not an Avdiivka situation yet, but the Russians have been making worrying pace of advance to the north of Pokrovsk that could result in a tighter and tighter cauldron that make the fighting there increasingly difficult. And this goes for a lot of the air raids. I'm changing the topic right now because I'm getting an air raid alarm right now at 5 p.m. on Tuesday. That's why I'm recording. And that has been a signal of how a lot of the Russian air attacks on Kyiv and elsewhere have been moving more to daytime, when before it was mostly a nighttime event. I'm thinking a week or two ago, I was just walking around outside, down by the river, nice summer weekend. Everyone's out there with, their kids riding bicycles and stuff like that. And above our heads, a Russian drone specifically, is blown up. Most people did not react very strongly to that. But if you look into everyone's eyes around you, everyone is like, did you just see that? Wasn't that crazy? Like, yeah, guy, that was pretty crazy. That drone just blew up right above our heads. But that has been the summer trend, is that these drone attacks are taking up more of the day. One of the more tragic drone attacks, though, in a rather difficult month, June specifically was our deadliest month on record, and July has slowed that down a bit. Well, on record since the early months of the invasion, when the Russians were bombing everything up north. But since those first months of the invasion, June was the worst month. July has so far not been as deadly as June was, but still pretty bad. And one example of a rather depressing drone attack was in a village outside of Kherson. As some of you may know, that we did not cover it nearly enough because it is unfortunately just a fact of life now. The Russian army practices something called the human safari in Kherson and other cities along the front line, where they videotape themselves attacking civilians, post it on their Telegram channels, and use it as entertainment. This human safari is used as a training exercise for Russian drone operators. If you're new, before you get sent off against more difficult to deal with targets in the military, you are first unleashed on civilians who do not have as much cover, who do not have as much defenses, and therefore are easier to kill. And one victim of these attacks this month was a 1-year-old child in a village outside of Kherson. They were in a crib just outside their front door when the Russian drone zeroed in on this 1-year-old and murdered them. This was deliberate. It was all on camera. They posted it as something to be proud of, and that is the human safari. And what every part of Ukraine that is within droning distance of the Russians is now facing. However, ending our battlefield update on something a bit more optimistic about, in the technology sphere, the Third Assault was able to capture position and took prisoners in that position using only drones. So Third Assault, a unit that was split off from Azov, although they're currently in the same regiment after some readjustments to military organization. So Third Assault using a couple of ground-based drones, so picture a remote-controlled car, except this remote-controlled car is about the size of a large dog, maybe, and armed with explosives. Get a bunch of those together, stormed a Russian position. Some of those were just simply blew up inside of a trench. They were able to drive into a trench, explode out the sides, and kill the people in it, while others were able, remarkably, to accept the surrender of the other Russians at this position. On a strategic level, this wasn't a huge deal. One position was taken, positions change hands every day, change all over the place every single day. However, this was a first in modern warfare of solely using drones to capture territory. And in the future, if this program can be expanded on, if the military can rely more and more on drones rather than assault infantry, that will save lives. Apart from also just being a bizarre sci-fi future that we live in, where we are fighting wars with robots rather than people. Well, preferably, once we reach that point, rather than people. However, with the tragic, there is one more tragic side story to the very intensive Russian drone attacks. Drones have become more and more common. Drone attacks include more and more drones, making the skies ever more dangerous. A pilot named Maxim Ustimenko, in late June, he was on a mission to shoot down incoming missiles. Often, the most reliable way to shoot down incoming missiles is to literally just send fighter jets up to shoot them down. A missile is just an aircraft in its own way. And Maxim was on one of these missions, intercepting multiple missiles until his own plane was struck. Knowing that he was going down, he was able to steer his plane away from a populated area so that only he would have to die when he crashed. Fighter pilots are a small group of people, especially within Ukraine, that does not have a very large air force, and they're some of the most prestigious and highly trained members of the Ukrainian military, which means that he had many friends, many admirers, many people who saw him as a hero, and it was as a hero that he died. So glory to the heroes, rest in peace, Maxim Ustimenko. In our next segment, we're going to be talking about more of these assassinations. This assassination war is always ongoing, and within this last month, we have seen 2 examples of it, one for each side. On the Russian side, the former mayor of Luhansk was assassinated. He was blown up by an improvised explosive device in Luhansk. Really not much to say about that, seeing as how he was out of power. He had been removed from office last year, I believe it was. I forgot to write that down. Either 2023 or 2024. I could edit, whatever. And Manolis Pilazov was, as I said, the former mayor of Luhansk under the occupation authorities. Prior to becoming a traitor, he was a local politician in the Luhansk region and was very much tied into not only the Party of Regions under Yanukovych, but also the local soccer federation. He was the president of the Luhansk Oblast Football Federation and was even president of football club Zorya Luhansk, one of the main football club of Luhansk. So he was in the sports world, which is often very corrupt. In 2014, he switched sides to Russia and was appointed mayor at the end of that year and held that office until 2023. One of many traitors and collaborators who have met their end and have met justice. The other assassination, though, was much more involved and bizarre, and has only become more bizarre as this story has developed. And that was on July 10th, Colonel Voronich of the Security Services of Ukraine was shot outside of his home. A security camera caught it on tape, showing a man kind of stalking behind him, kind of pacing behind the park in front of his house, before eventually just bum rushing him, shooting him at a very, very close range, and running away. Only for a couple of days later, the Security Services of Ukraine that they had neutralized 2 FSB officers who were responsible for the attack. Colonel Voronich was a very prominent and storied member of the Ukrainian security services. He was the head of an Alpha Group team, Alpha Group being the direct action, we can say, arm of the security services of Ukraine, who function somewhere between CIA teams, commando units, sabotage, reconnaissance, and assault. This team that he headed was responsible for a lot of very prominent actions, including the assassination of the terrorist known as Motorola. Motorola being an infamous Russian militant who committed many crimes, torturing Ukrainian prisoners of war, and being overall one of the biggest scumbags in a group full of scumbags, until he was assassinated in 2016, apparently as a part of the efforts of the group run by Colonel Voronich. So Voronich was obviously a very high-level target, a very serious loss to Ukraine's clandestine services, and that would have been a bizarre enough story on its own. This Ukrainian spy boss assassinated in Kiev before his assassins themselves being taken out. That's already a pretty intensive story. And then responsibility for this assassination was taken by a man named Rinaldo Nazzaro. Rinaldo Nazzaro is the leader of an American neo-Nazi group known as The Base. The Base follows a strain of American Nazism that believes in establishing a white separatist ethnic state in the Pacific Northwest, as in the eastern parts of Washington, Oregon, as well as Idaho. In the 1990s, you had a lot of these white supremacists go to the Pacific Northwest in order to make these like compounds. This was very much tied into the Oklahoma City bombing, for example, Elohim City, although that was in Oklahoma, but part of this broader trend of white separatism that existed in the 1990s. And even today, a lot of these white separatists do exist up there, and especially the Idaho Panhandle, where just last month, actually, during some wildfires in Idaho, a white nationalist set a trap for firefighters and killed 2 of them. So this is still very much a trend that exists. But the base has been one of the larger white supremacist terror groups operating largely in America and Canada. And their prominence, their very attention-grabbing name, the name is actually a reference to Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda means the base. They're trying to be cute with it. And for that reason, the leadership of the base has been under very heavy scrutiny by federal law enforcement, leading the founder, Ronaldo Nazzaro, to flee to Russia, and where he has lived since 2018 in St. Petersburg. So we have this very prominent American Nazi group that is openly terroristic and is being run out of Russia. Now, take 2 years ago, we had this information, but it then becomes just a matter of inference. Well, obviously, this Nazi group runs out of Russia. Probably they're connected to Russian security services. That just makes sense. Anyone can figure that out. But in more recent months, we have found that, they are directly working for the Russian intelligence. There have been a number of terror attacks in Ukraine this year. And what has made them stand out is how innocuous the terrorists themselves have been. There has been a trend of essentially recruiting marginalized, very, very poor, impoverished Ukrainians, telling them that if they deliver a box to a location, they will receive X amount of dollars. And these are poor people, easy to take advantage of, and on society's fringes, and therefore probably not as tuned in to what's going on around them. So they have accepted this money, planted these packages, and have killed not a huge number of people, but a noticeable number of people, mostly targeting recruitment offices, military recruitment offices. And it turned out that the people funding a lot of these attacks have been the base, Ronaldo Nazzaro. But those are all pretty simplistic attacks, right? Pay a poor person to plant a bomb somewhere. What that really takes is money, and apparently he had money to do that with. So how does that escalate to an assassination attempt on a high-level Ukrainian intelligence colonel? We're still trying to puzzle that out, to be honest. This was a huge step up in the complexity of the attack. It's not as simple as going to Google Maps, figuring out where the recruitment office is, and saying, go here. This was a very high-level person who obviously would have had some kind of counterintelligence around him to prevent assassinations, and had shooters stalk and eventually execute him. That's more difficult, and it is now the job of the Ukrainian intelligence services to figure out how that could be done. But what we know now is that, yes, Russia is in direct contact with very prominent American Nazi groups, and those American Nazi groups are doing the direct work of the Russian government. Next up, we have an update to the Olenivka case. The Center for Human Rights in Armed Conflict has recently released a report on the Olenivka prison camp. The name of this report is Barracks 200, Who Killed Ukrainian POWs in Olenivka and How. This was, as it says, a report identifying the weapons and ammunition of the Russian armed forces used to kill Ukrainian POWs in Olenivka on the 28th of July 2022 and elaborates on the planning, organization, and implementation of the killing. It also reviews the progress in Russian, Ukrainian, and UN investigations of the killing and provides recommendations to further the Ukrainian investigation. In short, what happened was that the Russians were holding a large number of prisoners, largely from the Battle of Mariupol and largely from Azov, in the Olenivka prison camp. This was a large barracks-like structure used to hold these POWs, and they had been moved there fairly recently, at which point this building was struck by a missile. The Russians claimed that it was a Ukrainian missile, and that Ukrainians had killed their own soldiers in this prison. However, the trajectory of the missile, the type of missile used, and a lot of other facts point to the other story, which was that the Russians deliberately destroyed this prison. that it was, in effect, a mass execution. There were survivors of this strike that have said that the guards of this prison had been removed that night, and that is only the start of how suspicious this case was. And as I said, this happened in 2022, so plenty of time has passed to investigate and pass around all kinds of versions of stories of what happened there. But this report is the most recent and one of the most thorough in supporting the story that I said, that Russia deliberately blew this up, killing around 60 Ukrainians using a thermobaric round. This has largely been the consensus anyway, but it's good to always have further investigations, especially investigations in connection with, though not directly a part of, always have to throw in those disclaimers, the United Nations. And in the last of our smaller segments, before we get to the main stories of our episode, is that in France, a Crimean Tatar by the name of Ilnur Shagayev was arrested by the French police. Now, he did not do any kind of crime in France, but rather he was held on an Interpol red notice by Russia. Interpol is essentially the way that law enforcement agencies communicate with each other. If a criminal is wanted in one member state of Interpol, that country can put out something called a red notice, which asks other countries connected to Interpol to arrest them. Now, in a lot of movies, Interpol is its own police agency with its own investigators and all that. That's not the case. It is a bureaucratic organ that mostly exists to facilitate communications between the law enforcement of different member states, not its own police force. But anyway, maybe I've just watched too many movies, and no one else has that impression of them that I did when I was a kid. But moving on, Interpol has these red notices, and they are frequently abused, especially by Russia. So it is often the case that Russia will put out red notices for political prisoners, people who they want to have arrested, who they want other countries to do the dirty work of investigating and arresting Russia's own dissidents and setting them back. This has happened in the past many times. Chechens especially have been victims of this tactic. Russia will say that some Chechen is an internationally wanted terrorist, put out the Interpol red notice, and France or Germany or somebody else will arrest them, send them back to Russia, where in Russia they are tortured, killed, and left in some forest somewhere. This has happened plenty of times in the past. And Ilnur Shagayev had fled Crimea with his family shortly before the full-scale invasion because he was facing increased pressure from the Russian government. He was a Crimean Tatar activist, and the Russian government really truly hates Crimean Tatar activists more than almost anybody. So Shagayev was able to go to Ireland, was able to get temporary protective status, and with his family was able to live there in a state of somewhat security from Russia coming after them. However, because of this red notice, he was arrested in France. And much like anyone else, these are political accusations against him. He is accused of being a part of a terrorist group, which in Crimea means any Crimean Tatars are just considered terrorists, basically. Especially any Crimean Tatar who at all advocates for his community, and especially any Crimean Tatar that advocates that Crimea is part of Ukraine. And that's enough for this red notice to go out, and member countries of Interpol apparently respecting that notice. Now, that is kind of where the story is ending at the moment. He was taken into custody by the French police, but he has not yet been deported. I have my doubts that he will be. I believe that he will eventually be released once the lawyers get involved, and that hopefully the French police recognize that not only are these obviously bogus charges, but also that by deporting a Crimean to Russia over crimes that supposedly happened in Crimea would be an indirect recognition of the Russian annexation of Crimea, which they can't really do. So hopefully because of that, this can be resolved. But until then, this will be a holding pattern on this story. I'll be paying attention to if this guy is eventually released, and if there's anything that can be done to put pressure for his release. So yes, on to our two big stories. First, having to do with the United States, and second, a very extended series of worrying developments in the sphere of Ukrainian politics. So first up, the United States. And as always, the Trump administration is as inconsistent as ever. So this story begins with another arms shutoff. The United States had, once again, put a pause on the arms shipments that were already on the way to Ukraine. This happened without Poland especially knowing, Poland being the country that those arms were in when the Americans decided to send them back. This had happened in the past. So when earlier this year, the Americans shut off arms shipments to Ukraine, these were done basically without any kind of announcement, took everyone by surprise, including, again, Poland, the people transferring those arms in the first place, and having weapons go through their borders, something that is not a small deal. This time, though, was more strange, as it seemed like Trump himself did not know about this arms shutoff, possibly. Instead, it seemed to have largely been on the initiative of a man named Elbridge Colby. Elbridge Colby is one of those bizarre ideologues that found their way into the Trump orbit and into his government. But he's a bit unique in that Elbridge Colby himself is a bit of Washington royalty. His grandfather, William Colby, was the director of the CIA in the 1970s and headed up the CIA's activities in Vietnam as the Saigon station chief. So, top spy kind of dude. And now we have his grandson, Elbridge Colby. And him being a part of this Washington royalty is important because a lot of the weirdos who have fallen into the Trump orbit have been, let's face it, a lot of them have been internet Nazis. Just weirdo internet Nazis who made themselves even come from a wealthy background, but were not taken especially seriously until they proved useful to Trump, such as Bosayevic, for example. And Elbridge Colby had a position in the first Trump administration as a deputy assistant secretary in the DoD. So there's a bit of, so he's not a non-factor, but of course now he has received quite a promotion to now being the Undersecretary for Defense for Policy, a very important role in the DoD. And Elbridge Colby, though I have presented him as, this kind of stodgy, inside-the-beltway aristocrat, has himself been a bit of a wackadoo, especially if you have been following him on Twitter. He was a deeply unpleasant person on Twitter during the Biden years when he didn't have a job to do otherwise. And his whole thing is essentially that the United States has to focus exclusively on China. Middle East, no. Europe, no. Africa, abandon it. 100% of America's energies have to be focused on China. And because he is a wackadoo, his strategy for doing that have been highly questionable, which has mostly come down to berating American partners in East Asia for not doing enough to counter China. He has been very mad at Japan, of course, but even though American policy vis-a-vis China, as far as great power competition goes, will largely focus on the question of Taiwan and wanting to prevent the People's Republic of China from conquering Taiwan, Colby doesn't seem to have much affection for the people of Taiwan themselves. And in fact, if he could bomb Taiwan to non-existence and simply replace it with an American airbase, that would be much preferable for him. Similarly, South Korea, he's gotten it in with just about all of America's partners in East Asia, which you think would be counterproductive to building a set of alliances in the region. But as a part of this strategy against China, what he wants to do is to build an alliance with Russia against China. So basically doing a reverse of what Richard Nixon did with the détente with China and exasperating the Sino-Soviet split. Only this time taking the side of Moscow against Beijing rather than the side of Beijing against Moscow. And to do that means surrendering Ukraine, a thing that he thinks he has the authority to do. But in the absence of that authority, he'd rather just compel a Ukrainian surrender by starving Ukraine of any defense aid and forcing them to surrender to Russia due to lack of being able to fight back. Another terrible plan that cannot work, but one that he thinks would. And so, to this end, he shut off these arms shipments to Ukraine and basically got a rubber stamp from the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, who himself is an idiot and a goon and has no idea what he's doing at any given time. Now, like I said, it seemed like Trump was not aware of this happening. Apparently, the person who told Trump about this sweeping change in American policy was actually German Chancellor Merz. I'm sure Trump finds out a lot of information from third parties who are asking him why this horrible thing happened. Not to absolve Trump, of course. The plan, as stated in Project 2025, was to capture these agencies and wield them in ways harmful to America by putting these toadies into place so that when it comes time for them to act independently, they will do something horrible. So this was, at least indirectly, by design. However, apparently when Trump learned about this, he did reverse this decision, leading to a whole bunch of contradictory statements. First, apparently saying that America would support the bombing of Moscow, which that would be great, thanks, but followed up pretty much immediately by saying he wouldn't do that. To track every change in American policy within that about week-long span of time would be impossible, so I'm not even going to try, and just move on to how it ended up. And that was that Trump gave a warning to Russia. Apparently he gave a 50-day warning. We found this out 10 days into that 50-day warning, and now we're most of the way through those 50 days. And this warning was that Russia would be forced into a ceasefire within those 50 days, or else America would put on secondary sanctions, as with countries that did trade with Russia. Of course, these are just words. The threat was that there'd be a 100% tariff rate on countries that did trade with Russia. We don't know what kind of trade. Does that mean any kind of trade? Does that mean specific types of trade? I assume that it would focus largely on fossil fuels, because that is the one thing that Trump does seem to really want to compete with Russia on, is the export of liquefied natural gas. But what does this mean? And it's a thing that involves tariffs with Trump, which means that what the policy could be would change every other day, allowing for weird insider trading to happen, and before eventually crashing out the market several months down the line. So anything involving tariffs, I can't trust, and nobody can trust, so who knows what that will eventually mean. A more reassuring thing came down the pike, though, was that the House of Representatives passed an aid bill, which included aid for Ukraine. This is the first time this has happened since Trump has come into office. It is really the worst case scenario that we saw coming down, was that all aid of any kind would be shut off. Now we know that something is coming. Now under Biden, we knew that these somethings were coming on a steady and reliable basis until Republicans got in the way, but it's something. This vote passed in the House with the majority of Republicans voting against it. But, as I've stated many times, in the House, all that really needs to happen is to get all the Democrats to vote for something, some Republicans to break with party ranks, and for the Speaker of the House to allow it to come to a vote. The votes are there. The Republican Party as a whole does not support it. Only a minority of the Republicans support it. However, more than enough support it in order to make a majority with the Democrats. A problem that would be lessened if Democrats had more seats, but we deal with the hand that we are dealt. And the news that I just got today was that apparently the first part of this aid that is coming to Ukraine will be done to refurbish Bradley fighting vehicles, a vehicle that had a pretty solid reputation for its assault capabilities, though because of attrition in spare parts had become less and less of a fixture on the front lines. There's also supposedly a deal in the works that would allow for Ukraine to trade drone technology to build drones, sell them to the US in exchange for other arms deals. Again, details we don't know, and this is all rumor and maybe, but it seems like it could happen. And finally, there has been permissions, it seems, from the US to sell weaponry to Europe, and for Europe to give it to Ukraine. So for a while there, America wasn't even selling weapons to Europe that could have gone to Ukraine. That at least seems to be over. So things looking better in the United States than they were. My guess for a lot of this time has been that the Russians were playing their sympathies in the U.S. very poorly. I think that if the Russians had shown a bit more contrition, if they had pretended even a little bit that they're ready to go to negotiations, there would still be pressure by the United States for Ukraine to be in those negotiations. But because for all this time, Ukraine shown itself to be the one who was ready to negotiate, and Russia kept saying no, 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 that eventually the Americans got frustrated, and that eventually the pro-Ukraine faction within the Republican Party, a faction that is in the minority, but present it is, was able to gain the initiative. Especially as right now there's a million other things going on in the world. There is, of course, just the war between Israel and Iran, and that if we can get Trump distracted on enough different things, then it allows Ukraine's friends in the Republican Party to act more decisively to push some of that policy through. So that could be what's happening. Or next month, or when these 50 days expire, he changes his mind again, and it all goes to hell again. Who knows? Who knows what happens with the U.S. government anymore? And Elbridge Colby still has his job, so the second that someone's not looking again, he could cut off anything he wants to do to Ukraine, he can do. Especially since they had already seeded that story, that the reason for why they had to do this was that America did not have enough arms to send to Ukraine or to send to anyone, and had to tend to its own needs before it could help out Ukraine. Something that was completely nonsense, completely disproven, but that talking point is now there. And talking points do not die very easily. It will be brought up again. And we're going to finish up with domestic news, Ukrainian domestic politics. We have 3 stories. I'll go in order of a positive one to a neutral one to one that is an utter catastrophe. So good news first. Warm me up with some good news, which is that there has been a court ruling that recognizes at least one couple as a same-sex civil union, I think we can call it. So there was a gay man, Zoryan Kis, and his partner, Timur Levchuk, who lived as a couple, but because of Ukrainian legislation, the Ukrainian Constitution says that a marriage can only be between a man and a woman. Though in the current climate, where the rights of partners has been even more important than in the past, involving family reunification to see people in hospitals. If there is a gay service member and he or she dies, would their partner be able to collect the benefits, for example? And this has all become a pretty salient issue within Ukrainian politics, and one that has gained ever more support. Support for at least a civil union, I guess we can call it, has been increasing in Ukraine to the point where if there was a vote on it, it would probably pass. However, because it is a constitutional issue and the Ukrainian constitution cannot change in times of martial law, this law therefore cannot be changed until the war is over. But there are ways around that, I suppose. And this court was able to recognize, for the purposes of state bureaucracy and such as that Zoryan Kis and Timur Levchuk were functionally, in a bureaucratic legal sense, married, a civil partner, and entitled to the rights of a family member. Zoryan is a Ukrainian diplomat. This decision was based on the idea that while the Constitution of Ukraine does not allow for same-sex marriages, it does guarantee, quote, the equality and dignity of all citizens. Meanwhile, there is a kind of common law system in Ukraine that says that if people live together long enough, then they can be considered family members. So put these two concepts together, and they kind of engineered their own version of same-sex civil marriage. They also took into account various decisions made by the European Court of Human Rights, and that Ukraine has bound itself with the European Commission on Human Rights that allows for same-sex family partners. So a bit of legal dancing around the topic, but they got to the point. And then it makes complete sense. This is what we want. Though, keep in mind that Ukraine is not a common law country. So in a common law country, such as the United States or Great Britain, then precedent becomes extremely, extremely important in interpreting the law. Therefore, in America, when there is one court case that rules on something, then probably every other court case will rule at least similarly unless they can find a compelling reason not to. Ukraine, like most of continental Europe, instead has civil law that does not have as much importance placed on this concept of precedent, meaning that just because this couple had their partnership recognized does not mean that a different couple in a different court will get the same treatment. So it is a justification that worked for this couple that could work more broadly in the future, but is not necessarily a full replacement for gay marriage. But it's the best we can do right now. So that was the good news. Moving on to what I mostly see as neutral news, but with some negative things buried in it, which is that the cabinet, the Ukrainian government cabinet, the various ministries, has been largely replaced. This is not a complete reshuffle, but pretty extensive. Only a handful of people are still going to be in their same spots as they were beforehand. And before getting into why, I'll just give the who. And that is that the new Prime Minister of Ukraine is Yulia Sviridenko. She'll be replacing Shmyhal as the Prime Minister. She's a neoliberal technocrat. She's a Margaret Thatcher type. The fact that she has Margaret Thatcher's policies as well as being a woman kind of makes those comparisons quite ubiquitous at the moment. The former Prime Minister, Shmyhal, is now going to be the Minister of Defense, while the previous Minister of Defense, Umerov, is going to the National Security Council. Alexei Kuleba, who had a bit of falling out with the government and had been reassigned, is now back in favor, apparently, as the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Infrastructure and Territories Development. As we get into our next story here, this is the ministry that had gotten into some hot water. Mikhailo Fedorov will remain as the Minister of Digital Transformations. He is losing some of his education portfolio, though. Andrei Shibiha will still be the Minister of Foreign Affairs, while the new ambassador to the United States, an unfortunately very important position, will be Olha Stefanishina. She had formerly been the main diplomat in charge of European Union accession. She has a good working relationship with the Americans. She was a point person for the mineral deal that happened a few months ago. The previous Ukrainian ambassador, Markarova, was not well liked in the United States because I guess she had integrity, maybe, but she had a rough relationship with the Trump administration, and I see someone having a difficult relationship with Trump as a good thing, but never mind. As an ambassador, it did hold her back some. So this new ambassador to the U.S. has a better relationship with the U.S. that may be able to make some changes in that regard. Now for the whys. Why did these changes happen? It has essentially been a very stale government. During the course of martial law, there cannot be elections. There cannot be an actual changeover in the parliament. Theoretically, members of the parliament can leave the party to form new ones, but that's probably not going to happen. And so it's become a very kind of moribund institution that does not have much vigor to it. And to be completely honest, a lot of the members of the current parliament, especially from the Servant of the People party, a lot of them, when there's a lot of new faces, well, not new anymore. At the time of the elections, there were a lot of new faces, where Zelensky brought a lot of first-time politicians into office. A lot of these people did not have much experience with politics. A lot of them were business leaders or some other kind of community leader that kind of put it on an audition to go into national politics. And so they were very often people with other responsibilities and commitments and went into national politics as kind of a side gig. Now, that can be seen as a positive thing. Fresh blood was good. But that fresh blood has been there well past the time that they thought that they would be in, probably. So there's a lot of members of parliament right now who would actually prefer to resign but aren't allowed to. They're kind of trapped in their position. And so because of this lack of elections, the only way to make any change to the Ukrainian government is to change the cabinet. Cabinet members can be appointed and fired and reappointed and shuffled around and have different people in different positions to hopefully do different things. The only change that can possibly happen. So that's why it happened now. Ukraine needed some more vitality, I guess, in its cabinet. And even though many of these people have not changed their jobs that much, this might do that. And that's going to be my positive view on what happened. And even Shmihal being supposedly downgraded from Prime Minister to Minister of Defense, honestly, Ministry of Defense is a more important position than Prime Minister right now. The Prime Minister mostly just kind of proceeds over the Rada more than anything else, even though there's also a speaker of the Rada. Like, Ukraine does not have a strong Prime Minister system, it has a strong presidential system. And so the prime minister, especially now when everything is controlled by a strong majority by a single party, the servant of the people party, the prime minister is not a very independent politician. That said, on the point we can get a bit more pessimistic, and the episode's going to be kind of downhill on this point forward on that regard. So the new prime minister, Sviridenko, she, like I said, is very Thatcherite. She is very strongly opposed to workers' rights, very strongly opposed to state assistance. And right now, Ukraine has a lot of people who were put out of work, who were made homeless because their homes were blown up, and even soldiers who rely on state assistance because perhaps they were crippled defending their country. That's now all under threat, and in fact, she has already moved to put a fourth legislation that would cut away inspections on businesses that violate labor law and safety laws. And since there's not going to be anyone making sure those businesses aren't breaking labor law, that means those businesses have permission to violate labor law. Law is only as good as it is enforced, and enforced equally and impartially. And that's pretty much gone, or at least it very easily can be. A lot of the changes she wants to put forward to whittle away at workers' rights had been attempted in the past. Twice on this show, we've had on our guest Vladislav Sodobutsev, who has an experienced labor activist, explaining these changes in the past. Some of those negative changes were averted by political pressure by the labor unions, especially, but now they're going after these labor rights once again, and they could very easily win. Because now their priority is now we have an ideologue in office who really, really hates labor law. And I'll definitely have more complaints in our final segment, but this one is more suited to this specific topic. There is a lot of frustration within Ukrainian society, especially the parts of Ukrainian society that are actively involved in the military or the volunteer movement, that there is a segment of Ukrainian society that is frankly not pulling its weight, that the oligarchs, the wealthy, sit back in Kiev or Lviv or Odessa or go on their vacations to France or Tenerife or Dubai, living lives of luxury, while the poor, the workers, the soldiers suffer for it. Now, does this always translate into social assistance demands? Not necessarily, though there is a strong push for better veterans' rights, obviously. And many of these oligarchs or business leaders, depending on how positive or negative you want to have the connotation there, many of them, of course, donate to the armed forces, but there's still corruption. There's still them wanting to squeeze Ukrainians for everything that they're worth. And meanwhile, you go to like some fancy restaurant, see fancy cars and people dressed in fancy clothes. And what I see, and what many people see, what the soldiers see, how many drones could that have bought? How many tourniquets? How many stretchers? How many ambulances? Not everything in Ukraine has to be reduced to that, of course. People are allowed to live their lives. People are allowed to have an element of comfort. But it becomes obvious when that becomes abuse. In this oligarch class that is still making their money, still getting rich, while people become poorer, while people are getting killed, while people are being dispossessed, and the oligarchs still want more profits, more control, more power. Meanwhile, the people who have been fighting against them the hardest are now the people out in the military. The anti-corruption activists, the people who want to build Ukrainian society to be better, more equitable, more just robust in every way. Those are the people joining the military, and they're the ones dying right now, so that the oligarchs can sit in Kiev with their expensive prostitutes and enough cocaine to drop an elephant. Maybe they think that if the Russians come in, they'll still have their position, so they don't have to do as much. Maybe they think that everyone else will do their part so they get to be a free rider on the system. Maybe they're not thinking anything at all. Maybe they're just being little rodents scurrying for whatever morsel is in front of their face. This tension is very real, and it has largely been controlled because we have other things to worry about, i.e. Russia coming in to try to kill everybody. But people can only absorb so much. And this act to put this mini Thatcher in charge, if she wears down on the quality of life of the Ukrainian soldier because of it, who has to worry more about their families not having what they need, then this tension will become more acute. The conflict will become more severe, and people may start making demands. Yeah, this new government, there's concerns. Mostly, most parts of it are the same. The prime minister is worrying. And the other worrying part is that it seems like she got the job because she is closer to the presidential advisor Yermak. Andrei Yermak is seen as Ukraine's Grey Cardinal, the head of the office of the president of Ukraine, who is making a lot of the decisions himself and is a bit of a caustic personality, to say the least. And the concern now is that this shakeup changed in order to give him more influence than he did previously. And that's something to worry about. So most of this government change, fine. I understand it. I even see some of the positives of having this change, as I've explained. But if it signals what the priorities are in the coming years, we're going to find some problems in the future. And for our final story, one that I'm very much upset with, as well as basically everybody else in Ukraine right now, is the wearing down of the independence of the Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine. However, because I am quite literally about to go to a protest about this little change in policy as I'm recording, and this is very much a developing story, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause this recording, and I'm going to come back to it right before we release the episode, because I have a feeling that tonight can be interesting. So with that, I'll be signing off. To you, it will just be about 2 seconds, but to me, it will be a whole day. So see you then.
And I'm back, and wow, crazy. In that brief interlude, I wrote a whole article. I'll put it up in the show notes there. So yeah, what are now, when I was recording yesterday, didn't exist yet, but as of now, a rather significant protest movement has begun in Ukraine. But let's back up and explain what exactly happened. So over the course of the last about 2 months or so, but really going back much further, there had been a rather concerted effort on the part of the Ukrainian government, especially the Ukrainian security services, to go after NABU, the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine, as well as the Special Anti-Corruption Prosecutor, SAPO. And these are two extremely important institutions in Ukraine in that they are kind of the most direct policy-based result of the Revolution of Dignity, Euromaidan in 2014. In the Euromaidan revolution, the reasoning given often for them was that Yanukovych had not signed the EU association agreements, but that's not all it was about. It was about a much deeper culture of corruption and political graft that had existed in Ukraine that had very serious, nasty effects on the Ukrainian economy and therefore standard of living. It was, and unfortunately remains, a substantial amount of corruption in Ukraine. And so in the time after Maidan, when civil society was having a lot of political clout, and also international partners were coming into Ukraine to offer aid, one of the conditions for that aid was the creation of these anti-corruption investigations and prosecutions, incoming NABU. And in the time since then, NABU had always been very under siege by the government. Under Poroshenko, I remember him doing it a few times where he threatened the independence and workability of NABU. And afterwards, there were threats by international partners that aid would be withdrawn. There's a lot of Ukraine's international aid, international support that is specifically predicated on the existence of independent and robust anti-corruption instruments. This includes, of course, the International Monetary Fund, which is very important to the Ukrainian budget, but also, for example, the agreements that allowed for there to be freedom of travel between Ukraine and the Schengen zone in Europe were predicated upon having this good anti-corruption system. Or even look at some of the problems that Ukraine has had with the Americans. A lot of what was involved with Ukraine Gate, or forget which one of those scandals did what thing at this point, but amongst the scandals involving Trump interference in Ukraine, a lot of that came down to Ukrainian officials who had been targeted by anti-corruption efforts and lost some of their political influence, in part because of it, getting their revenge and getting the Americans to kind of settle their scores for them. So Nabu really has been at the center of events for the last decade. But it seems as though the government finally saw the opportunity to really go after them. So I said, like, the last 2 months, there had been or mainly the last month, but this had been building up as well. The government had been going after particularly Vitaly Shabunin. He's the head of the Anti-Corruption Action Center NGO and is on the board of Nabu and is very tightly involved with their investigations and affairs. He's not the director, but an important person with it. And he has been under investigation for draft dodging, essentially avoiding his military duties, which is pretty odd considering that he's signed up to join territorial defense on the first day or so of the full-scale invasion. So this person who is quite literally enrolled in the military is being accused of being a draft dodger, dodging military duties. Now, in complete fairness, there have been some complaints about him in that he is splitting his time between the military as well as his anti-corruption duties. He never left. So I did see some complaints from within civil society saying that one should choose one or the other, cannot do both. A soldier cannot have as a political of a position as an anti-corruption investigator, but also it divides time. If you're dividing time between military and this anti-corruption work, that means you're not devoting fully to either one of them. So that is some of the complaints about him, but that's not criminal. That's something that maybe a government board can make requests of him for, to say that if you are going to continue this arrangement, then you have to step down and appoint someone else to take over your responsibilities, something along those lines. It's not a criminal thing, but the SBU, Security Services of Ukraine, has been criminally investigating him for this, as well as doing fraud, allowing him to do this draft dodging. And the investigation has been very vigorous. There was one instance where they tried to break down the door of one Andrei Plishikov. Andrei Plishikov is a hero of Ukraine who is unfortunately no longer alive. You may know him more clearly by his code name, Juice. Juice was one of the most accomplished pilots in the Ukrainian military before eventually losing his life. There are murals of this guy. He is a hero. But he was also friends with Shabunin, and apparently Shabunin had stayed at his apartment in Kharkiv a few times. So the cops went to this apartment of this dead hero, tried to break down the door until a neighbor gave them a key, and it gave this poor mother of this hero of Ukraine such stress that she had to be hospitalized. The brazenness of that was ridiculous. But perhaps more seriously, the SBU was also investigating Nabu, saying that they had been infiltrated by Russian spies, essentially, or Russian assets, which is true. It does seem to be true. Ruslan Megamed Ruslov, the regional office head of their office in Dnipro Oblast, governing Dnipro Oblast and Zaporizhia Oblast, had apparently been a Russian intelligence asset. He was doing business, facilitating business with the Russian Federation through his father. His family were apparently Russian sympathizers and had direct and sustained contact with the Russian FSB. So that is, of course, very bad. This was a very sensitive area. Dnipro, in particular, will be one of the more important offices in a national anti-corruption agency because Dnipro has one of the larger economies in the country, and it is connected to some oligarchs with some shady connections in the city still. So this should be an office that has one of the best and not a Russian spy. Now, this arrest seems to be correct in that Nabu themselves seems to be acknowledging it with one catch. They are acknowledging it, but Nabu is claiming that the security services knew about this guy. Nabu had warned them about this guy. However, they are saying that the security services chose not to act, presumably saying that they wanted to be able to track this spy. That is one thing that's very common in counterintelligence. If you already know who the spy is, you can watch them do their work. You can track them. You can track their communications, who they talk to, and then build your network of counterintelligence off of that. Once you arrest a spy, you don't know who the other spies are. You have your known quantity. So that's not unusual. So I understand it. That's what Nabu is implying was happening. But the SBU, nonetheless, is claiming that the organization is much more penetrated by the Russian intelligence agencies than just him. That is likely. Most Ukrainian government agencies will have Russian spies in them. That's simply how it is. The security services of Ukraine have Russian spies in them. That's just how it is. However, the line here coming out of the government and especially the security services of Ukraine is that Nabu was so heavily compromised by Russian spies that it was simply no longer good for its purpose. It was too undermined. It was too full of Russian spies to do it. And honestly, that's kind of where they lose me and others. There was a huge series of searches by the security services of Ukraine against employees of Nabu. Apparently, they were pretty rough with it too. And then came the bombshell, where just yesterday, a bill was put in front of the Ukrainian parliament, the Verkhovna Rada, that would remove its independence as an agency. It would no longer be a self-standing, and instead would be put under the control of the General Prosecutor's Office. And the General Prosecutor is appointed by the president, essentially putting these anti-corruption agencies directly under the control of the president's office. This would make it virtually impossible for them to act against anyone within the presidential office, because that's how they're co-workers, essentially. That's who is giving them orders. They can't investigate the people who are giving them orders. That is a conflict of interest. It just doesn't work well, leading to the protests. But before we do that, we have to ask the question of why now? Like I said, there had been persistent attacks on the independence of Nabu and Sapo since they were created in the immediate aftermath of Maidan. So why now? Well, most directly, let's just get right to the most direct cause of what's going on here, which is that Nabu was investigating the former deputy prime minister. Alexei Chernyshov had different titles, but essentially he was the guy in charge of eventually reintegrating the occupied territory. And what he was being accused of by Nabu was that he had done some corrupt land deals. In his civilian life, he was a real estate guy, and really corrupt land deals are kind of the most common form of corruption, it seems. But what he was doing, allegedly, was selling off state-controlled properties at lower prices to land developers in exchange for bribes. So by bribing this guy, these developers would be able to purchase this land at a lower price. And this is what Nabu was investigating him for. And he was very tight in with the Zelensky inner circle. Again, he was deputy prime minister. And most directly, this could be seen as a way of either preventing or getting revenge for that investigation. They had also apparently been investigating various members of the Ukrainian security services for their corruption. So Nabu was very much antagonizing the presidential administration as well as the security services themselves. So maybe this reaction that was, again, very long in coming, they had, as I was explaining, always had been under the crosshairs of the oligarchs, but they were stumbling into much more sensitive investigations. Now, that could be one explanation. Another is that the government feels as though it has much more political cover now than it has in the past. Of course, during the war, it is much more difficult for not only average people, but also international partners to threaten the Ukrainian government with anything. What are they going to do? threaten to reduce aid to Ukraine, people will die. And as for the security services in particular, they are riding a very high level of support now after Operation Cobweb by pulling off the attacks on the Russian strategic bombers. The opinion of the security services are higher than they have been in the entire history of Ukraine. I did that one episode at NB talking about how this was basically their redemption moment, where because the SBU had been known as being so corrupt and known for being so undermined by the Russians for so long, that being able to pull off Operation Cobweb was a major show of how many of those problems had been fixed. And so this could be them cashing in on some of that goodwill. Perhaps. I don't know. That's just a theory. I haven't even heard anyone else say that before. So maybe it's just me thinking it, perhaps. And also, in order to do some finger pointing outside of Ukraine, a lot of what was protecting Nabu was the carrots and sticks related to European Union integration. It was a very important part of the agreements made with the EU, allowing for EU integration to move forward. However, Chancellor Merz of Germany had recently said that Ukraine's EU membership probably wouldn't even be on the docket until 2035 during their next round of planning, essentially. So if Ukraine's not joining the EU anyway, then why would anyone care about the requirements joining the EU? It was a very disheartening moment when the Germans announced that. And in response to this law, the Europeans have already kind of hinted that there could be repercussions in the form of aid, but I don't know. I don't think that they're going to do that. We don't know what will happen. But yeah, we'll get to the protests now. So as I was scurrying off from my reporting yesterday, I was heading off to the Ivan Franko Theater in Kiev. And I mean, it's a very lovely neighborhood. It's very kind of ritzy neighborhood. Lots of high-end sports cars in that neighborhood, just off of Krashadik, a bit up the hill there, is getting closer to the government quarter. And the Ivan Franko Theater is actually just at the bottom of the hill from where the presidential administration is. You cannot go to the presidential administration right now because the whole government quarter is sealed off. You have to go through checkpoints. They're not going to allow a bunch of people in. At the time of war, it's a very sensitive area. No one's demanding to be let into the presidential administration. But we were down the hill from the presidential administration. That can be seen from the windows there. That's why that spot was chosen. And this protest consisted of about 2,000 people. I would say most of them young. I briefly pointed out in my article in New Voice of Ukraine that these were people who were their early 20s. I'd say most of them were younger than 25, and therefore would have been too young to be part of Euromaidan. They would probably not have gone to a protest like this before, many of them, considering that if you wind back time, not only from the full-scale invasion, but then also into COVID, that's been a pretty long time that we haven't had so many protests. And also, a lot of that generation of people who took part in Maidan, they're now in the army. The activists who made up the Euromaidan revolution became the backbone of the Ukrainian military in a way, because they were the ones who were running to the front lines back in 2014. And ever since then, in all the various protests that happened between 2014 and 2022, they were usually headed up by people and movements that either had their start or gained prominence during Euromaidan, but the most are in Donbass now. And so it falls on to the younger people to take part in these protests. So you have very young, heavily female, as is often the case in Ukraine, and a lot of energy. The chants were nonstop. Of course, there's the whole host of different chants that are common in Ukraine. Just yelling shame, Hainba is the common one, but Ukraine is not Russia. Ukraine is not Russia. Russia is a country where people are quiet. They allow the government to do whatever it wants. They allow for the corruption. Not only do they allow for the corruption, they see corruption as just a natural element of life. Being anti-corruption in Russia is like being against the sun shining, is against being rain coming from the sky. It's gonna be there, It's a part of the natural flow. And Ukrainians reject that idea because Ukraine is not Russia. So it's there for most of the night, although now, of course, the night ends at 11 o'clock so everyone can get home before curfew. But the next day, that's all anyone was talking about. Every part of civil society, just if you go to social media, you scroll through TikTok or Instagram, these people who were, cosplayers or something, they were all going to the protest the next day. And the next day, so the day that I'm recording the second part, that 2,000 protests turned into 10,000 people just in Kiev. There are also protests. Well, yesterday there were protests also in Dnipro, Lviv, and Odessa. Now, in this protest on the second day, basically everywhere. Kryvyi Rih, Rivne, everywhere. Which means it's something the government certainly cannot ignore. They thought that they could sneak it through, go fast enough, give some story about how Nabu was all just Russians, and really, we're all too concerned about Pokrovsk right now to be worried about anything else, maybe. That turned out not to be true. And so, later this evening, Zelensky gave another speech saying that there would be another bill put forward that would strengthen the independence of Nabu. Now, according to them, they're still trying to save face with it, saying that this will still be a reform that will wipe away the Russian infiltration, and is the main one here, but they're also saying that Nabu was just working too slowly, not being efficient, that these reforms would make investigations and prosecutions go quicker, though that's just what he said. We'll have to wait until he said next week for this law to be introduced to the Verkhovna Rada. So we don't know what that will be. We don't know if it will be good enough. It might be. I mean, maybe 2 days of protest worked. I don't think so. I think that it will be necessary to have these protests every single day until we see that bill. And if that bill is not good enough, continue protesting. And if that bill is good enough, continue protesting just to prove a point about it. But it seems as though Zelensky realized that he made a very serious mistake and will have to correct it. A lot of this may have come out of Yermak, the head of the presidential administration. Zelensky is number 2 guy, our great cardinal. He may have overstepped. I think there may even come a point where people will demand the resignation of Yermak, but I don't know. But yeah, so now we're just going to wait. We're going to have these protests continue and see if their demands are met. I don't think anyone will be completely happy on the other side of this, but I am going to be optimistic that this protest movement worked. But now for my reactions to the stupid things on social media and unfortunately from politicians of the United States. So this closing segment here, before we have more updates, maybe next episode, what were the protests not about? And I've seen so many things of both honest mistakes as well as deliberate lies about what this protest movement is doing. And I guess the first thing I can say that's not about is that it's not a general anti-government protest. As always, it may become. If they go on too long, various causes will come together and add to the list of grievances, but that does not happen yet. Right now is very specifically concentrated on just this law. It's not, we don't like the government in general. It's not anything like that. Again, specific. And beyond that, to one of the main ones that I'm seeing is that a lot of people seem to think that this is asking for Zelensky to step down or for new elections or something like that. No, I haven't heard any actual protesters make that demand. You can have a protest for a specific topic and not call for a revolution. It's fine. There's no demand for new elections. There's no demand to replace Zelensky. That's one, unconstitutional. We've explained all the ways that election would be terrible many times in the past. You don't have to relitigate it, but just no, that's not what people are asking for. And in fact, I think that people need to remember that politics is not only elections. And so in a situation like Ukraine is in now, where there cannot be elections by either law or basic safety, that doesn't mean other forms of politics cannot happen. Protests, petitioning legislatures. In our last segment, we were talking about how you can still change up parts of who's in what position in government to see what happens. That's can be done without elections. Street politics are also important. And when the time comes that street politics becomes necessary, such as this one, That's when you do it. And this should be a reminder for people in countries that do have elections that just voting is not enough. The full spectrum of political action must be taken advantage of at any situation where those actions become either useful or even necessary. The United States still has elections. The United States also defunded its anti-corruption investigations. You can just do corruption and white-collar crime right now because no one's stopping you. The president does it on TV. Time to protest. Time to make demands heard, which is what Kyiv, as well as many other cities, are doing now. And sure, this does harm Zelensky's image. These are the first anti-government protests of the full-scale invasion. That means something. The political consensus of essentially supporting the government is over. There were other protests, but over much more specific things. At any given time, you can go past City Hall and see a protest for an illegal construction or something. But this is the first large-scale thing that was being protested that Zelensky could control. And it's all in his hands now of how he will handle this. If he handles this well, then his reputation will be tarnished. But continue. Maybe he might have to select a scapegoat to throw under the bus, even though everyone knows that this is directly called for through the presidential administration. He can blame the Rada or something. I don't know. He can maneuver his way around this in a way that is not exactly honest, but preserves his political image, maybe. We'll see. We're only 2 days into this. But finally, the last thing that seems to be shunting around, and this most prominently came from Marjorie Taylor Greene in the United States, is presenting these protests as being about surrender, of Ukrainians being fed up with Zelensky and his stupid, unwinnable war against the Russians. And that is, I mean, it's Marjorie Taylor Greene. She's a Nazi. But this is the most insultingly bad take there can possibly be. The various versions of this that eventually all lead to Ukraine being conquered by Russia. Do you really think that if Ukrainians are on the streets protesting and now the tens of thousands against an act that would have changed around the oversight of an anti-corruption agency, if they're that mad about that, do you think they would accept Russian rulership? Again, Ukraine is not Russia. That's the point here. Russia is everything that Ukrainians are trying to avoid being. Russia is corruption. Russia is violence. Russia is ruled by militarism and gang. Russia is ruled by a leader who demands obedience and presents himself as the avatar of the nation, the fascist concept of the Führerprinzip. That's everything Ukraine is not. And not being that is worth defending. Corruption undermines Ukraine's defense. Every dollar that's squirreled away by some government official to buy a penthouse apartment in Cyprus is money that's not being used for the defense of Ukraine. Corruption is treason, and protecting anti-corruption agencies is protecting Ukraine. So no, Ukraine is not going to surrender. Ukraine is not saying that this whole project of being Ukrainian isn't worth it anymore. Nothing like that. This right here, the people out in the streets, that's what Ukraine is. This is what we're defending. Ukraine's not about the president. So this is our last bit here of a lot of, especially Ukraine supporters, saying that if you're going against Ukraine or if you're going against Zelensky, now you're going against Ukraine. That's not what Ukraine is. Ukraine is not the country of its rulers. Ukraine is a country that will throw tomatoes as its rulers if those rulers step out of line. Ukrainian politics is all about having hostility towards the people ruling over you and calling them to account when they step out of line. That's what I love about Ukraine. No kings, no rulers. There's the Ukrainian people. But I think that's what we'll be cutting off this episode now. This protest will continue. I already had some plans for a third episode of the month next week. But it's not a full episode, though, so I'll be able to integrate more coverage of these protests for next Wednesday as well. Let's see. Let's see where this is going. I don't know what will be in next episode either. This is exciting to see where this will go. So yes, thank you all for listening. Again, I'll be linking that article in the show notes. If you would like to support Ukraine Without Hype, you can go to patreon.com/Ukraine Without Hype. I'd also highly suggest that you go to the New Voice of Ukraine to see not only my coverage, but covering this from many angles over there. It's not just me. I have a lot of good op-eds running right now. NV, like a lot of other publications, are taking this as an opportunity to really kind of hold power to account. This is a moment. So head over there, head to patreon.com/NVUA to support them. I'm kind of turning my wheels on putting out a good video over there as well. But patreon.com/Ukraine without hype. And now I'd like to thank our subscribers. Before I do that, I will say that Patreon was doing something kind of weird this month, where a lot of payments were actually declined. I think to be the guy who complains about money. If you don't want to give me money, don't. But if you intended to give me money, but it didn't work out, maybe check on that. I don't know. I'm not going to be much of a bother with it. It was just unusual how many there were. Okay, so thank you very much to Randy McNerlin. The voices in my head are from Big Pharma, Arminius317, David Shepard, Giorgio Olenivka, Michael Drucker, Mike, PLM, Anonymous, Barbara Station, Dennis Napalm, Debbie, Dimitri Lippin, Elizabeth Hughes, James Burke, Yanara, Jen Louise, Kevin Alberton, Kyle Smith, Marguerite, Megan, Michael Wickman, Nick Yazin, Silas Frank, Guy Bart, Vivek, Abel Lenz, Abe McDonald, Alex Groshmo, Anastasia, Andrew Glenn, and Dystopian Fiction, Please Remain Fiction, Captain Technical, Chris Bennington, Christopher Yee, Dan, David Wall, Demetrio Munoz, Denman Jones, Emily Bona, Etienne Soleil, Evelyn, Francois, Grace Krause, Had to Laugh, Jacob Holm, James Wise, Jared Blandley, Joseph Aberlone, Drew, Julia Lindsay, Justin Devendorf, Justin R. Keith Valued, Kyle Johnson, Mar De Leon, Maria Lilla, Lemonican, Levy Grove, Marion, Matt Miller, Anonymous, Noah Brown, Noam Hart, RDP, and Marcus Nassis. Thank you all very much for what make this all possible. Until next episode, Slava Ukraini.